3 weeks before Marilyn Monroe died, she rewrote her will. She sat in her lawyer's office, surrounded by legal documents, and made decisions about who would inherit her fortune after she was gone. And here's what nobody talks about. She knew. She knew she was running out of time. She knew this wasn't theoretical estate planning. She was dividing up her life while she still had the power to choose who got what. And the choices she made? They revealed everything about who loved her and who used her. Because 1 year after her death, when that will was read, the betrayals began. The people she'd trusted most fought over her money like vultures. The man she'd considered a father figure inherited 75% of everything and turned her legacy into a business. And the world learned what Marilyn Monroe had known all along. In Hollywood, love and money are the same thing, and she'd never been loved for free. It was January 1961, and Marilyn Monroe sat across from her attorney, Aaron Frosch, discussing something most people avoid thinking about until they're much older: her will. She was only 34. She should have had decades ahead of her. But Marilyn understood something that most people her age didn't. Life is fragile, especially hers. Her mother was in a mental institution. She'd had multiple miscarriages. She was taking pills to sleep, and pills to wake up, and pills to manage anxiety. Her body was breaking down. And some part of her knew that the combination of fame and fragility and pharmaceutical dependency was a ticking clock. The first will was straightforward enough. She left money to her mother, to her half-sister, to her secretary. She left money to psychiatric institutions, which tells you something about where Marilyn's mind was even then. She wasn't thinking about jewelry or real estate or who got the furniture. She was thinking about mental health treatment, about helping people who were suffering the way her mother had suffered, the way she was suffering. The will was practical and sad and revealed a woman who understood that her greatest fear, inherited madness, was something worth fighting even after she was gone. But here's where it gets interesting. In that first will, Marilyn left a significant portion of her estate to her acting coach, Lee Strasberg, and his wife Paula. Not the majority. Not even close to 75%. But enough to acknowledge that they'd been important to her, that they'd helped her grow as an actress, that she valued their mentorship. It seemed like a reasonable, even generous gesture from a student to her teachers. What Marilyn didn't understand was that she was creating a dynasty for people who saw her as a commodity rather than a person. Lee Strasberg had become Marilyn's acting teacher in 1955 when she fled Hollywood for New York. She'd been desperate to be taken seriously as an actress, tired of being cast as the dumb blonde in every film. Strasberg taught method acting at the Actors Studio, and Marilyn became his most devoted student. She idolized him, called him Papa, trusted him completely, and Strasberg, for his part, seemed to reciprocate. He praised her talent publicly, worked with her privately, made her feel like she was more than just a beautiful body. For someone who'd grown up without a father, who'd been shuffled through foster homes and told she was worthless, having Lee Strasberg's approval felt like salvation. But there's a thin line between mentorship and manipulation, and Lee Strasberg walked it perfectly. He made Marilyn dependent on him, convinced her that she couldn't work without his wife Paula on set. Paula Strasberg became Marilyn's acting coach for her films, and studios hated it. Paula would undermine directors, confuse Marilyn with contradictory advice, make shooting schedules impossible. But Marilyn wouldn't work without Paula, because Lee had convinced her that Paula was essential to her process. It was brilliant, really. Lee and Paula Strasberg had made themselves indispensable to the most famous actress in the world. And Marilyn, who'd spent her childhood desperate for family, for someone who valued her for more than her looks, couldn't see it. She thought the Strasbergs loved her. She thought they saw her as more than Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol. She thought they recognized Norma Jean, the smart, sensitive, damaged woman underneath the performance. What she didn't realize was that they'd built a career on her insecurity, that every time they told her she needed them, they were making sure their financial future was secure. By 1961, Marilyn's career was struggling. She'd been fired from Something's Got to Give for chronic lateness and absences. Studios were calling her unreliable, uninsurable, washed up at 35. Her marriage to Arthur Miller had ended. She was increasingly isolated, dependent on pills and the few people who'd stuck around. And the Strasbergs were still there, still coaching, still advising, still making themselves essential. And Marilyn, grateful for any loyalty in a world that had turned on her, rewarded them in her will. Wait until you hear what happened next. In August 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her home. Overdose of barbiturates. The world mourned. And within days, the will became a battleground. Because Marilyn had rewritten it one more time in March 1961, and the new version was shocking. She'd left 75% of her residual estate to Lee Strasberg. Not to her mother. Not to her half-sister. Not divided among her friends. 75% to the acting coach who'd made himself indispensable and was about to become very, very rich. The remaining 25% was divided up. Money to her psychiatrist, Dr. Marianne Criss, for psychiatric institutions. Money to her half-sister Bernice. Money to her secretary May Rice. Money to various friends. But the bulk, the majority of everything Marilyn Monroe would earn in perpetuity, went to Lee Strasberg. And here's the truly shocking part. At the time of her death, Marilyn's estate was worth about $800,000. Not nothing, but not a fortune. But Marilyn Monroe's image, her likeness, her films, those would become worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the decades. And 75% of all of it would go to Lee Strasberg and his heirs. The day the will was read, people were stunned. Marilyn's half-sister Bernice, who'd been close to her, was devastated. She got $10,000. Friends who'd supported Marilyn through her darkest moments got $5,000, maybe $10,000 if they were lucky. And Lee Strasberg, who'd been her acting coach for 7 years, got 3/4 of everything. The disparity was staggering. The betrayal felt complete, because everyone in that room knew that Lee Strasberg hadn't loved Marilyn Monroe the person. He'd loved what she could do for him, but here's what makes it even worse. Lee Strasberg didn't even go to Marilyn's funeral. The man who inherited 75% of her estate, who she'd called Papa, who she'd trusted completely, he didn't show up to her funeral. He sent Paula. He sent his wife to represent him while he stayed in New York. The message was clear. Now that Marilyn was dead, now that she couldn't perform anymore, she wasn't worth his time. He'd gotten what he needed from her. The rest was just paperwork. The funeral itself revealed who really loved Marilyn. Joe DiMaggio, her ex-husband from 7 years earlier, organized everything. He banned Hollywood from attending. He kept reporters away. He made sure Marilyn was buried with dignity, not turned into a circus. And for 20 years after her death, Joe sent roses to her grave 3 times a week. Not once, not for a few months. For 20 years. That's love. That's loyalty. And Joe DiMaggio got nothing from Marilyn's will. Not because she didn't care about him, but because their relationship was over by the time she wrote it, and Joe didn't need her money. He loved her without expecting inheritance. The will also revealed Marilyn's obsession with mental health treatment. She left a significant portion, the remainder after everyone else was paid, to Dr. Marianne Criss, her psychiatrist, with instructions that it be used to establish a psychiatric institution. Marilyn had spent her entire life terrified of ending up like her mother, locked in a mental institution, forgotten. And in death, she wanted to help other people who were suffering. She wanted to fund treatment, to make sure that mental illness didn't have to mean abandonment. The generosity of that gesture coming from someone who'd struggled so much herself was heartbreaking. But here's where even that good intention went wrong. Dr. Criss used Marilyn's money to donate to the Anna Freud Center in London. Not in America, where Marilyn had lived and suffered. Not to help American patients who needed treatment. To a center in London dedicated to Sigmund Freud's daughter. Now, Anna Freud was a pioneer in child psychology, and the center does good work. But it wasn't what Marilyn had envisioned. She'd wanted to help people like her mother, people trapped in American psychiatric institutions. Instead, her money went to fund academic research abroad. Another betrayal. this time by someone who was supposed to understand her mind better than anyone. The most painful part of the will situation was watching people fight over money while claiming they were protecting Marilyn's legacy. Lee Strasberg immediately began licensing Marilyn's image. He controlled her likeness, her films, everything. And he was aggressive about it. Any company that wanted to use Marilyn Monroe's image paid Lee Strasberg. Any documentary about her life needed his permission. He'd turned Marilyn Monroe into a brand, and he was the CEO. The woman who'd begged to be seen as more than a commodity became the most commercialized dead celebrity in history. And the man who'd promised to help her be taken seriously as an actress was the one selling her, Paula Strasberg. Lee's wife had been Marilyn's on-set coach and supposedly her close friend. After Marilyn's death, Paula wrote extensively about their relationship, painting herself as Marilyn's protector and closest confidant. She described how Marilyn had depended on her, how lost Marilyn would have been without Paula's guidance. And maybe some of that was true. But it's hard not to notice that Paula's entire post-Marilyn career was built on being Marilyn Monroe's acting coach. She dined out on that connection for decades, giving interviews, writing articles, always positioning herself as the person who really understood Marilyn. And all of it funded by the 75% Lee was earning from Marilyn's estate. Arthur Miller, Marilyn's third husband, came out of the will situation looking particularly bad. They'd been divorced for over a year when she died, and he wasn't mentioned in her will at all. Which makes sense. Why would you leave money to an ex-husband? But what made people angry was what Miller did after her death. He wrote about her, extensively, in his autobiography, in interviews, in barely disguised fictional accounts. And always, he positioned himself as the intellectual who'd tried to save the tragic blonde. He'd loved her, he claimed, but she was too damaged to save. The narrative was self-serving and cruel. He'd failed her in life. Couldn't handle her fame, couldn't deal with her mental health struggles, grew cold and distant during their marriage. And in death, he turned her into a character in his own story of artistic suffering. The will also exposed the transactional nature of Hollywood friendships. People who'd been photographed with Marilyn, who'd attended her parties, who'd called themselves her friends, they were nowhere to be found after her death. Or worse, they were there, but only to claim their piece of her legacy. Everyone wanted to be associated with Marilyn Monroe, the icon. Nobody had wanted to deal with Marilyn Monroe, the struggling addict, in the months before her death. There were exceptions. A few people proved genuine. Pat Newcomb, her publicist, had been with Marilyn the night before she died and was genuinely devastated. She'd protected Marilyn from press intrusion, had tried to manage her image without exploiting her. She got $5,000 in the will. Not much, but the amount wasn't the point. Pat had been there when Marilyn needed someone, and she never tried to profit from the connection afterward. That's the difference between real friendship and Hollywood friendship. Bernice, Marilyn's half-sister, was another person who loved her without agenda. Bernice had reconnected with Marilyn in the 1940s after years of separation, and they'd maintained a relationship despite the distance. Bernice lived a quiet life in Florida while Marilyn lived in the Hollywood spotlight. Bernice never asked for money, never sought publicity, never tried to use her connection to Marilyn for personal gain. And she got $10,000 in the will. The disparity between what Bernice got, a blood relative who genuinely loved her, and what Lee Strasberg got, a mentor who'd monetized her insecurity, tells you everything about how thoroughly Marilyn had been manipulated. The estate itself became a circus. After Lee Strasberg died in 1982, everything passed to his third wife, Anna Strasberg. Not his children. Not anyone who'd known Marilyn. His third wife, who'd never met Marilyn Monroe, who married Lee years after Marilyn's death. Anna Strasberg inherited control of Marilyn Monroe's estate, and she turned it into an empire. She licensed Marilyn's image aggressively, fought legal battles against anyone who tried to use Marilyn's likeness without permission, and built a fortune on Marilyn Monroe merchandise. Coffee mugs, posters, Halloween costumes, fragrance deals. If it had Marilyn Monroe's image on it, Anna Strasberg got paid. The woman who'd called Lee Strasberg Papa, who'd trusted him like family, had her image turned into a global commercial enterprise by a woman who never knew her. There's something particularly grotesque about watching Marilyn Monroe's image become worth hundreds of millions of dollars after her death when she'd struggled financially in life. She'd made good money as an actress, yes, but studios had exploited her, underpaid her compared to male stars, and fought her when she tried to negotiate better deals. In the last years of her life, Marilyn was worried about money. She'd been fired from her last film, sued by Fox for $500,000, not getting hired by other studios. She died without financial security. And within a decade of her death, her image was generating millions in licensing fees. And none of it went to the people she'd actually cared about. The will also revealed Marilyn's continued generosity even when she had reason to be bitter. She left money to her secretary, May Rice, who'd been loyal and supportive. She left money to Dr. Chris, despite the complicated relationship. She left money to friends who'd stood by her. The will wasn't petty or vengeful. It was thoughtful and kind, which makes the betrayals that followed even harder to accept. Marilyn had tried to take care of people, and they'd turned her legacy into a business opportunity. What's particularly painful is wondering what Marilyn would think if she could see what happened to her estate. Would she be horrified that Lee Strasberg, the man she'd trusted like a father, had turned her image into a commercial brand? Would she be angry that Anna Strasberg, a stranger, controlled her legacy? Would she regret leaving 75% to someone who clearly valued her wealth more than her humanity? We can't know. But based on everything Marilyn said in life about wanting to be taken seriously, about wanting to be valued for more than her body, about wanting to escape the Marilyn Monroe persona that trapped her, it's hard to imagine she'd be happy with what her estate became. The other devastating part of the will situation was how it contrasted with Marilyn's actual final days. In the weeks before her death, Marilyn was struggling. She was taking too many pills, drinking too much, increasingly isolated. She'd call friends in the middle of the night, terrified and alone. And where was Lee Strasberg? In New York, running his acting studio, not checking on the woman who'd made him wealthy, who'd trusted him completely, who was clearly in crisis. If he'd really loved her, really seen her as family, wouldn't he have noticed she was spiraling? Wouldn't he have intervened? The fact that he didn't says everything about what their relationship actually was. There's a scene that perfectly captures the betrayal, the reading of the will, with lawyers and beneficiaries gathered, and Lee Strasberg realizing he's just inherited 3/4 of everything. Did he protest? Did he say, "This is too much"? Marilyn must have been confused. This should go to her family? No, he accepted it. He took the money. He took control of her legacy. And he spent the rest of his life monetizing her image while claiming he was protecting it. That's not love. That's business. The will also exposed the broader Hollywood system that had failed Marilyn. She'd been exploited by studios, objectified by directors, underpaid compared to her male co-stars, and treated as disposable when her mental health and addiction issues made her difficult to work with. And in death, the exploitation continued. Her image was worth more dead than alive because dead celebrities can't object to how they're used. They can't say no to licensing deals. They can't fight back when their image is used to sell products they'd never have endorsed. Marilyn Monroe, the person, had some agency, some ability to resist. Marilyn Monroe, the dead icon, had none. And Lee Strasberg controlled her. The money itself wasn't even the worst part. It was what the money represented. Proof that everyone who'd claimed to love Marilyn had been using her. Proof that the family she'd tried to build, the Strasbergs, her friends, her colleagues, had been a business relationship all along. Proof that she'd died alone not because she was difficult or troubled, but because the people around her cared more about what she could do for them than who she actually was. Arthur Miller's betrayal was particularly insidious because it was literary. He didn't fight for money. He had his own success as a playwright. But he took Marilyn's private pain, her struggles, her vulnerabilities, and turned them into material for his work. After her death, he wrote a play called After the Fall, with a character clearly based on Marilyn, a troubled blonde actress who commits suicide. He claimed it wasn't about her, but everyone knew it was. He'd watched his wife suffer, watched her struggle with addiction and depression, and when she died, he used her pain as artistic inspiration. That's a betrayal of a different kind. He turned her suffering into his story. The will situation also revealed how thoroughly Marilyn had internalized Hollywood's values. She'd left the bulk of her estate to Lee Strasberg because she believed that acting was the most important thing about her. Not her kindness, not her generosity, not her intelligence. Her acting. And the person who'd helped her act better deserved to inherit her legacy. She'd been brainwashed into believing that Marilyn Monroe the performer was more valuable than Norma Jean the person, and she'd distributed her estate accordingly. It's heartbreaking. What makes the story even more tragic is that Marilyn had been writing and rewriting her will for years. Each version revealed where her mind was at that moment. The early versions were optimistic, leaving money to future children she hoped to have. Later versions removed those provisions after multiple miscarriages. The final version, written in 1961, was the will of someone who knew she was running out of time. She wasn't thinking about the future anymore. She was trying to take care of the people she thought cared about her before it was too late. And most of them proved her wrong. The will also showed Marilyn's continued hope that mental health treatment could save people. By leaving money to psychiatric institutions, she was saying, "I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to feel like you're going crazy. I want to help other people get the treatment I couldn't get." It was generous and sad and showed that even in death, Marilyn was thinking about helping others. Which makes it all the more painful that her generosity was exploited by people who saw her as a profit center rather than a person. There's also something deeply sad about the fact that Marilyn's will had to account for her mother, Gladys. Gladys was still alive, still institutionalized, and Marilyn left money for her care. Gladys would outlive Marilyn by 2 decades, spending most of that time in psychiatric facilities, not really understanding that her daughter was gone. Marilyn had spent her entire life terrified of ending up like her mother, and in death, she was still taking care of her. That responsibility never ended. That fear never went away. And in some ways, Marilyn's early death was her escape from the fate she'd feared most, growing old and mad like Gladys. The betrayals continued for decades after Marilyn's death. Every time someone wrote a tell-all book about her, claiming intimate knowledge, they were profiting from her inability to defend herself. Every time someone sold letters or personal items at auction, they were turning her private life into public commodity. Every time Anna Strasberg signed another licensing deal, she was proving that Marilyn Monroe's value had always been commercial, not personal. The people who claimed to love her kept using her, long after she was gone. What's most painful is imagining Marilyn sitting in that lawyer's office in 1961, making decisions about her will, trying to take care of the people she thought loved her. She was being thoughtful. She was being generous. She was trying to do the right thing. And she got it so wrong. She trusted the wrong people. She valued the wrong relationships. She thought Lee Strasberg saw her as a daughter when he saw her as an investment. She thought her friends would protect her legacy when they'd turn it into a business. She thought the will would show her love when it ended up showing her exploitation. The final betrayal came from Hollywood itself. After Marilyn died, the industry that had chewed her up and spit her out suddenly mourned her. Studios that had fired her, directors who'd called her difficult, co-stars who'd complained about her. They all released statements about how tragic her death was, how talented she'd been, what a loss to cinema. It was grotesque. They'd treated her terribly when she was alive and struggling. They'd contributed to her isolation, her addiction, her desperation. And when she died at 36, they acted shocked, as if they hadn't seen it coming, as if they hadn't helped create the conditions that killed her. The will was Marilyn's last attempt to control her narrative, to choose who benefited from her life and death, and even that was taken from her. Lee Strasberg controlled her image. Anna Strasberg turned her into merchandise. Arthur Miller turned her into literature. Hollywood turned her into a cautionary tale. None of it was what Marilyn wanted. None of it honored who she actually was. The betrayals that began with the reading of her will continued for decades, proving that Marilyn Monroe was more valuable dead than alive, and that the people who claimed to love her had been using her all along. In the end, the will revealed a simple, devastating truth. Marilyn Monroe had spent her entire life looking for love, for family, for people who would value her for more than her beauty or her fame, and she died surrounded by people who saw her as a commodity. She'd tried to reward loyalty, and instead she'd enriched betrayers. She'd tried to help others with mental illness, and her money went to institutions she'd never heard of. She'd tried to take care of the people she loved, and they'd turned her legacy into a business. The will that was supposed to show Marilyn's love and generosity became the document that proved she'd been used, exploited, and betrayed by almost everyone she'd trusted. And that might be the saddest part of her story. Even in death, Marilyn Monroe couldn't escape being treated as an object rather than a person. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. When does mentorship become manipulation? Should estates be able to profit endlessly from dead celebrities? Who do you think really loved Marilyn for herself and not what she could provide? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more deep dives into the human stories behind Hollywood legends, the betrayals behind the glamour, and the truth behind the icon. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.